Welcome to the Historical Romance Sampler podcast. I have a special episode today. I am joined by Olivia Waite to talk about book bans and why romance readers should care. Olivia writes queer historical romance, fantasy, science fiction, and essays, and she's also the romance fiction columnist for the New York Times Book Review. Since she and I are both members of the Authors Against Book Bans organization, she graciously agreed to join me today to talk about what book bans are, how they're happening in the United States, and why romance readers should care. So, Olivia, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh no, it's exciting. I'm always happy to talk about book banning and the right to read.
Yes. And I just want to preface that we are going to be talking in the context of the United States because we're both in the US. Authors Against Book Bans is focusing on the US. And I don't know much about the international sphere, but I think international listeners, you might learn something about what's happening in the US and so that you know what to look for in your community. And so I invite you into the conversation as well.
And a lot of this is going to go into I have some snippets of like historical perspective, because one of the things that I've been writing about and other historical romance authors have been writing about is historically limitations on reading and printing in Britain. So,
Mm, I love that. Okay,
yeah.
now my nerd is excited too. So let's start by defining book bans. In terms of our conversation and generally in terms of authors against book bans, how do you think about the definition of book bans?
Well, more specifically, like right now in America, when we say book bans, we mean removing books from public and school libraries, and it's mostly the line is that it's protecting children. And of course, that's just, a good sales pitch. It's not what they're actually doing. Let me go briefly through the general process of getting a book into a public or school library. You
Love
have a
it.
librarian. They're not just sending a box or a cart down to the local bookstore, filling it up and bringing it in. It's a very involved process with several stages of vetting. They usually look up the title online. They check the Library of Congress categories. They check trade reviews from paid professionals, like not me personally, but people very much like me, who publish reviews in places like Library Journal and Booklist and Kirkus, specifically for librarians and school librarians to use in evaluating books that are coming out. So those will get either starred reviews or very specific descriptions. A lot of times librarians will get advance copies, so they've read these books themselves. They will check patron requests from the community. So usually if they're buying a book, there's at least one person in the community who's asking for it. So by the time a book is on the shelf at a school or public library, it's been evaluated several times over for its quality, its value, and its use to the community. So when you pull that book as somebody from outside that system, you are claiming that your fear of whatever identity is in that, because as we see, these book bans overwhelmingly target queer and BIPOC authors and writers and characters. So you are asserting an authority and an expertise that you do not have. You are saying your fear of other kinds of people is greater than these many layers of expertise that a librarian has been trained to use.
Right, because most librarians have master's degrees, so they are highly
Yeah,
educated to begin with before starting that whole system.
exactly. 72% of current book bans in the United States are being initiated by organized groups and elected officials. These are not people with expertise. These are people who are grandstanding to make a political push. They are not an overwhelming majority of your community. They are people like Moms for Liberty and that one Florida dad who issued 200 requests for materials to be pulled.
Right. They are not representative, but they are trying to eliminate this work from the community rather than say, oh, I don't want my child to read that book and
Exactly.
keep it within their house.
They're not just saying, well, my I have the right to say what my child reads, which let's not even get into that as a concept. Speaking as somebody who was a kid who read everything, like
Right.
kids deserve to read what kids want to read. That's
Right.
something I believe. But anyways, that's a whole we could do 30 minutes just on that issue alone. So they're not only trying to parent their own children, they're trying to parent everybody's children, is what it's coming down to. I'm going to give you a recent example. The two things to take away from this about book bans in the United States are one, they are organized, and two, they tend to lie. Recently, the Supreme Court was hearing arguments in Mahmoud v. Taylor about pulling a children's book from a public library shelf. And sitting Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch described some of the illustrations in this picture book as having BDSM elements and depicting a sex worker. And this is not at all true. If you go to the actual book, what's on the page is somebody's holding a sign with a cartoon portrait of Marsha P. Johnson. Doesn't say who she is, doesn't say what she does, just a memorial cartoon doodle. And the BDSM elements are on one page, somebody's wearing a leather jacket with spikes on the shoulders.
Wow.
And so he knows it's ridiculous if he says, but somebody's wearing a leather jacket, we must ban this book. He knows that makes this argument look absurd. And so what he says is he couches it in this language. So when you see book banners object to sexual content, hardcore pornography in schools, divisive elements, what they mean is they're trying to stop queer people and Black and brown and people of color from existing in public as people.
Right. Which is a reason enough to want to say, hey, let's stop this. And we are all readers in our communities. I will admit that as recently as last year, 2024, I kind of was like, well, I don't have kids. I'm not in school systems. Like, this is bad, but it's not really my problem.
Mhm.
And then more recently, as an author, I have been paying a lot of attention to it. But a question I'd love to ask is for romance readers who are reading adult titles from public libraries or not even from public libraries, from Kindle Unlimited, from wherever,
Mhm.
does this affect us?
Absolutely. It affects us immediately and it affects us even worse down the road. One of the first things that happens when you designate certain types of people as dangerous to children, and we saw this back in the 90s when there were all the arguments about should we allow gay people to teach in schools. If you designate a class of people as inherently dangerous to children, then it's very easy to make it a crime for those people to be in public or around children at all. And then you have broad criminalizations against an entire group of people, and that's bad for all of us adults on the whole. So you'll see things like teachers getting fired or criminally charged for having a book about Ruby Bridges on the school shelf. And we've already seen some challenges like that in some of the states that have been pushing book bans. You also have the consideration that social media and algorithms and retailers like Amazon are going to be paying attention to these legal maneuvers, and they're going to start to ban some of the books that you're enjoying as an adult on your own. They're going to say, well, it's not worth being sued if we're carrying explicit sexual content for grown-ups. It's not worth being sued if we're carrying queer or trans content. If they start to use child pornography laws to go against trans romance on the internet, then all of us romance adult authors are going to be impacted, even if we don't have kids and aren't getting books from school and public libraries. So this is an old, old pattern. There's nothing new here. We've seen this before. We've seen this in the 90s. We've seen this in, Regency and Victorian Britain. So it's a very familiar pattern at this point, and it's important to recognize that it's happening and to do what you can to stop it in your own community. Now,
Yeah.
the good news is that there's a lot of ways to get involved and there's a lot of ways to help. Your local library probably has a friends organization you could join. Local school boards have open meetings where you can stand in support of your community and in support of the children who deserve access to books about the issues that concern them. Kelly Jensen at Book Riot has been tracking book bans in all 50 states, and she's always got pieces coming out explaining what's happening in your local area and how you can get involved. You can join Authors Against Book Bans if you're an author or illustrator. I feel like ALA is doing some legislation tracking.
Hmm.
They've also got social media graphics you can download for free and share on your local networks to get people more informed about what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I was just looking at the ALA website, and they just recently in April released their analysis of what was happening in 2024.
Yeah.
And one that surprised me was that 55% of the book challenges, the majority of the book challenges that they tracked, were in public libraries, and only
Yes.
38% were in school libraries.
Mhm.
And we've seen in places like Idaho that there are legislation where, if a book is challenged and deemed inappropriate, it has to be put in a completely different room than the other books. But
Yes.
most of these libraries are so small, one-room buildings, that means they either have to completely eliminate their adult collection of books or
Hmm.
shut down.
Yeah.
And so it
It's
is,
an eliminationist stance. It's soft censorship. It's discouraging purchases that they know are going to be too difficult for them to maintain and impossible in some cases. Yeah,
yeah, and so it puts at risk the general public library in addition to what the children can read.
exactly. And public libraries have been a huge good in American culture at large. And anything we can do to defend them is going to benefit all of us either now or in the future.
Yes. Now, I'm excited about historical facts. Tell me about the historical context that you'd like to bring to the conversation.
So when I was writing The Care and Feeding of Waspish Widows, which is set in 1820, which is this big year of mass protest in Britain. And a lot of the people protesting weren't even eligible to vote. It was a lot of women and it was a lot of lower class people who just had strong feelings about political structures and events and wanted to make those opinions known however they could. This was just after the Peterloo massacre, so people protesting for working conditions and the rights of the lower classes had been literally shot by the militia. And there was a lot of restrictions and limitations on what people could and could not print and could not buy and sell and read. This is when you had booksellers like Robert Carlyle actually going to prison for printing seditious material, criticizing the political institutions of the time. You would have militia people sent in to literally wreck up bookshops and look for, radical political materials and illegal things. You had taxes on the price of paper that meant a lot of small pamphleteers were just immediately put out of business because they couldn't afford to pay to print the materials that they'd been printing, which is the same kind of soft censorship we're seeing with library purchases right now. And there's actually a lot of historical romances that happen around these particular restrictions. We like to think that the modern day is always more progressive than the past, but it's really wild to go back into some of this history and see one of the things they didn't want people printing was tracts about universal suffrage, so everybody should get a vote. That was considered very scandalous and left-wing and radical. And women shouldn't get the vote, and free love, which happened in the Regency. There were multiple people arguing that we should do away with all sexual stigma and people should be able to sleep with whoever they want. And the government was clamping down on that as obscene. And, if they'd used the phrase hardcore pornography at the time, they would have absolutely been putting it on those books. And so you have a lot of resistance that has to exist kind of on the margins of the legal system. And it's really fascinating and it's a really good draw for romance because there's so much tension and there's so much just story possibility around this. So, Care and Feeding of Waspish Widows is all about a printer and a printer and engraver who meets a beekeeper, and it's all about political change in this one small town where the beekeeper lives. And so it's this very friends to lovers. Well, these big protests are happening and what effects they have on the lives of the people in this one town. So it's not
Hmm.
just who's in charge at the parliament level or the royalty level. It's what are we doing in our local communities? Who's trying to change things? Who's attacking their neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. You've also got Annick Trent's, which is
Hmm.
a sapphic historical romance about a seditious reading club in a pub in London. And so you have this housemaid whose friend has been arrested as part of this crackdown on this political reading club that happens in a tavern. And in order to exonerate her friend, she needs testimony from another woman, and they end up slowly falling in love in light of this complex political sphere where it's literally illegal to be caught reading some of these materials.
Yeah.
And for all that, it's a wonderfully dread-free romance. So it's really on the ground kind of stakes. It's working class Regency, and it's charming as all get out. It's absolutely wonderful. Rose Lerner's Lively St. Lemiston series starts with a newspaperman's widow who starts up the press again, and the son of a local political family who starts writing with her. He's got an injury from Waterloo. He's got some trauma. His mom is causing political trouble in the town. And that's wonderful. And that kicks off her whole small town Regency politics series, which is great. For other queer romances, you've got KJ Charles, Fit to Print, and Will Darling Adventures, where he runs a bookshop with some illicit material in, I want to say, the 1920s with spies
Mm.
and his like dealing with his experiences from the war and the shady spy he falls in love with over the course of three very complicated murderous books. On the American side of things, we've got Alyssa Cole's A Hope Divided, which is the
Mm.
second in her Civil War spy trilogy about Black spies who are spying for the Union during the Civil War. And this one is a Black herbalist in a slave state. And she's hiding an escaped Union soldier in the attic. And because they can't be overheard, they start writing letters back and forth to one another and discussing like philosophical books. And it's just so beautiful. So they're sitting just on other side of the wall, slipping notes to one another so they can communicate, and it's just gorgeous.
Yeah, I think that was my first Alyssa Cole book, and I was like, oh, wow.
It's so good. That whole trilogy just floors me. Like,
Yes, yes.
and the last one is also newspaper based, and it's Courtney. Oh, and I say that, and then I forgot the actual title, but it's the Courtney Milan.
Suffragette scandal?
That's a really good one. One of the reasons why I love the suffragette scandal is because it's it's more hopeful. It's not just about the embattled nature. It's about hope being a muscle that you exercise. There's a really great metaphor for small scale achievable protest in there that's really I find it very refreshing and it gives me I don't know. It's like a little warm hug you can carry around with you, that book.
Jane Fonda said at the SAG Awards this year, if you've ever watched a documentary and wondered what you would do, this is your moment.
Yeah.
And I feel that way a lot with historical romance, where, I write historical romance that is pretty progressive, and I certainly read a lot of historical romance that is progressive. And always these characters seem to have more courage and face bigger obstacles than I've ever had to face.
Yeah.
But, and I think that's one of the roles of fiction is to put you in a heightened position. I hope not to have to face something like hiding in an attic.
Right.
But for all the historical romance readers out there who love that type of story, I invite you to think about how can you pull inspiration from these characters or from the real life historical people like Richard Carlisle. I read his memoirs, if you can call them that. His daughter published his like
His
journals and
diaries
letters.
and yeah.
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 I read that just at the start of this year, and like he was cheerfully going to prison for printing seditious materials. And he was
Yeah,
like,
and his
yeah,
book
and when
still
I get
stayed
out, I'm
open
going
and
to
he
print
was writing.
again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he was writing to the women who were keeping the bookshop open in his absence. And yeah, there was a whole thing.
Yeah, he was like, this isn't shutting me down. This is funny. I'm going to keep going. And so I've been trying to think about that when I feel discouraged. I'm like, but Richard Carlisle was in prison and he wasn't discouraged. So,
And even like there's so many stories about this kind of thing. Like if you look at things like the French Resistance, there's so many hideous stories out of the French Resistance, but there's also Mary Burchell, a romance author who wrote Harlequins. She wrote wonderful, sweet little Harlequins about the fashion industry in Paris. And one of the things she did with her money was she and her sister, who were big opera fans, they would travel to Germany in the 1930s and they would be put into contact with various Jewish families and they would accept, things like jewelry and small treasures and movables. And they were posing as, well, we're these wealthy British opera fans who don't trust the servants, so we carry all our jewelry with us. And so they wouldn't get searched at the border. And they would take
mm,
all of these valuables back to England, meet up with the families who weren't permitted to take anything of value out of the country, and give them back to the families. So they had like both heirlooms and something valuable to start with in a new life in exile. So then it made it possible for people to leave Germany who wouldn't otherwise have gotten out. And she saved like 1,000 people's lives doing this.
wow.
There was a Polish countess. Well, she wasn't a countess. That's the whole point. There was a Polish mathematician when the Nazis took over. She forged identity documents and posed as a countess to help save the lives of people in the camps. And there's
Wow.
just so many different opportunities. And it doesn't all have to be big, flashy, showy, like, let's make believe I'm a countess stuff, although that is the fun stuff to read about. But
Yeah.
it's things like supporting a book at your local library. It's things like showing up to an author event. It's things like letting your neighbors know where you stand, and it's letting the people in your community know that you support the existence of people who are different. And it's very practical and it's on the ground and you can do a lot right where you are. It's standing up at a local library and telling your neighbors this book deserves to be on this shelf.
Yes, absolutely. And that moment when you first start speaking up can feel very scary.
Yes.
And that's where you can draw courage from these larger than life stories and say,
Yeah.
well, I'm going to learn how to speak up. I think if you are listening to this podcast, you're a reader. And I think any reader can relate to wanting to read something.
Yes.
And it who's going to tell you not to read it? Like that's so unfair. Everyone should be able to read what they want to read.
Yeah. And like if you haven't been to a protest, go to a protest, meet some people, wave a sign. It's very easy. You can stay just for an hour if you want. It's very pleasant when the weather's nice.
Yes.
You could organize a read-in somewhere at a local park or at a library where everybody brings a book and just sits in silence and reads. Like there's so many different options. You could plan a protest party and have a great time dancing. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be dour, angry marching and violence and threats. That's not what it's about. You can stand the side of the road with a sign and ask people to honk if they support, queer books.
Right.
And
Or you
people
can
will
go,
honk, and it's great.
yeah, and you can write letters to your school board, you can write letters
Yep.
to your library board.
Letters to the editor of your local newspaper, that's a big thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for authors, you are more than welcome to join Authors Against Book Bans, authors and illustrators. For readers, there are a lot of different organizations. One that I recommend is Every Library.
Yes.
They're very focused on supporting local organizations, so they will let you know if something's going on in your community. And
Hmm.
they also share their wins, which I have really loved. In this year alone, we have seen a lot of scary ban legislation go
Yeah.
up in different states, and we've also seen it get shut down because readers and community members have said, no, that's not acceptable. That's not what we want.
Yeah. If you follow Authors Against Book Bans, even if you're not an author, if you follow Authors Against Book Bans on Instagram, Blue Sky, a lot of those social medias will have location specific and state specific information. So when there's action, then you can like find a short little script and a guide for what to do, and it makes it really easy and it makes it low key. And you don't have to sit here and feel bad about things as a form of activism. You make a phone call to a senator to support your public libraries. You make a phone call to your local representative. You send a letter to your local library. And then great, you've done your protest for the day and you can go and sit in the garden and read, say, a KJ Charles books about an obscene bookstore.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Are there any other points about book bans that you wanted to make before we wrap up?
One of the other things that I want to say is buy in print when you can.
Hmm.
One of the things that we know is when books are starting to get banned, it's easiest to go after the electronic editions and to pull things from Access. That's the easiest way to pull the plug on those. But they're not going to come into every house and take every print copy unless things get much, much worse than they are. Buying in print is the best way to support authors. It's the best way to support libraries, well, and publishers, and just do what you can. And if you can't afford to buy all the books you want, because who of us can, then you can spread the word on social media, post about what you're reading, what you're enjoying about it, support your library events. If your library is doing a drag story hour, absolutely show up to support them there. Check out local queer authors speaking in various bookstores around town. Just go sit in the audience and hear a book talk.
Yes. Yeah. And the more you read, the more you know. So
Exactly.
try picking up those banned books if you hear that they're banned and see what you learn. What
Yeah.
what are they afraid of you learning from these books?
Yeah, because they're not doing this because we have no power, is the thing to remember. They're doing this because it's powerful. They're doing this because what these books have to say is important and meaningful and honestly fun. A
Yeah.
lot of these books, like the Supreme Court book that I cited earlier, was called Pride Puppy, and it's adorable. It's about a dog who gets lost at a pride parade and they have to find him. And
Oh,
it's so cute and it's so sweet and everybody's in their best like pride costumes. There's a lovely drag queen who helps the puppy and it's just darling and joyous. And
yeah.
you look at it and what are they afraid of in joy? Why does joy scare them so much?
Yes. Yeah. Well, Olivia, thank you so much for coming on and talking about book bans, why romance readers should care, and for all the book recommendations. I'm gonna, you know, collect all of those and I'll put them in the show notes and also probably in a little Instagram carousel. So listeners, don't worry, you'll find those book recs. Besides the care and feeding of waspish widows,
Hmm.
besides that, are there any books or projects or anything you'd like us to check out of yours?
Well, currently my big project is a sci-fi sapphic mystery series.
Ooh,
So yes, and there is a library angle. The library is where all of the books are stored that you place all your memories in between bodies on this spaceship. It's very fun.
ooh,
So it's this big 1920s style cruise ship in space. And your memories are stored in the library. And then every time your body runs out, you're issued a new one and they put your memories right in. So you just kind of keep going on this 1,000-year journey across the stars. And ship's detective Dorothy Gentleman has been taking a bit of a break. She had a bad breakup. It was a little bit traumatic. And so now she's just been resting in the library until she wakes up in a body that's not hers, just as a murder's been committed. And so she has to
ooh.
figure out what's happening and why, and is somebody killing people? And it's one thing to kill a body because that's not a big deal on this ship. But then she finds somebody's been erasing books from the library,
Oh gosh.
which is much more serious.
Yeah. Well,
And
that
so
sounds fantastic.
yeah, that first one is called Murder by Memory, and that's just out. And the second one is called Nobody's Baby, and that's up for pre-order coming out this spring.
Ooh, that's so exciting.
It's been really fun to write, and I'm so excited.
Well, thank you again. And I'll also put a link to your website and I'll be tagging you on Instagram so readers, listeners can find you and your books.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. That's it for this week. Don't forget to subscribe to the Historical Romance Sampler wherever you listen, and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Until next week, happy reading!